Hola Rosa,
Hola, ¿cómo estás, Samuel?
muy bien, aquí empezando el día y estaba viendo qué hora era por allá por Minnesota y ustedes ya llevan varias horas de haber empezado, ¿no?
Sí, por lo menos 3 horas.
Ok, pues primero que todo, muchísimas gracias Rosita por tu tiempo, por la disposición de ayudarnos con esto. Yo creo que tus insights van a ser muy buenos para nuestros alumnos. Ahí vas a ver que hay una gran diversidad. Yo les voy a pedir, si te parece, al principio, que se presenten rápidamente, ¿verdad? Que se identifiquen de dónde son y dónde están, para que tengas una lectura del grupo. Y luego, si quieres, vemos cómo manejar esta plataforma. Si quieres tener control del PowerPoint, lo podemos probar ahorita.
Ok. Sí, estaba haciendo unas pruebas y me parece que sí, tenés razón. Tengo aquí mi presentación, ¿verdad? Quiero ver si la puedo poner en...
Slide share, ajá, ahí está.
estamos. Entonces, ok. Entonces, espérate. Muy bien. Entonces, cuando as a guest speaker by my friend and colleague Samuel Perez. As you may know, we are both Guatemalans, and this is why we know each other. We've known each other for a long time, maybe 20, 25 years, and the two of us are working and trying to leave a mark in other countries, but I think that both of us believe, like you guys, in how important we, and I say we, including you, because I see all the countries and continents that you are from, we are all citizens of the world, and as citizens of the world, we have a pretty good understanding of how this crisis, this pandemic is affecting all of us wherever we live, wherever we are from, and wherever our next projects in life are gonna be, because I think that in a long time, for the first time, this pandemic crisis is affecting all of us in a global scale. So what a great opportunity for me and for all of us to be here in front of you as, again, citizens of the world. So as an introduction, I don't know if you had a chance to read a little bit about me. Samuel sent you an article about me a couple of, maybe 10 years ago, but again, I'm from Guatemala, from Guatemala City, and I've lived in the United States for the last 15 years. So I'm a pretty recent immigrant to the US, and I live in Minnesota. For those who are from the US, and for those who have been to this part of the country, you know that we are very well known for our very long and cold winters. Actually, 2 days ago, it was still snowing here. So we are very well known for these winters. Sometimes it can get to minus 40 degrees in Celsius. And again, maybe you've heard of some of our teams here, the Twins in baseball, or the Vikings in American football, or the Timberwolves in basketball. And and we are also known for some very famous musicians like Prince and other artists and people in movies like the Coen brothers, who have come with, who created this kind of black comedy called Fargo, and that describes a little bit the mentality of Midwestern people here. But I've been fortunate to live in a state that cares about government, good governance, and also cares about people. But just that as a general introduction before I start with my presentation. Samuel had asked me to talk a little bit about the situation around the pandemic in Minnesota, the role of government, and also a little bit about the upcoming elections in the United States and how this pandemic might affect the elections in the US. So that's what I'm pretty much gonna talk about today as your guest speaker. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can intervene, or we can leave the questions at the end as well. I hope that you all are hearing me well. If not, please let me know. So I'm gonna share my presentation with you all. Is this one? I hope. Okay, so my background is in political science and public affairs. So I've been working in public administration for almost 20 years now. So I'm not in the classroom anymore. I used to be a professor as well in a private Guatemalan university back in the day, and this is where I also met Samuel. But right now my area of expertise, if you want, is in public affairs and public administration. And again, I believe that since as an immigrant, as somebody who has done some international work, I have this experience where I can see the world from this global perspective, but also as a local, in a local perspective in terms of the work that I do and the people I interact with. I work for a small state agency. It's called the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs, and pretty much our role is to advocate on behalf of communities of Latino, Latin American descent, but US American Latinos as well, at the state legislature and with state government, so that we can bring the concerns, the issues of Latino communities across the state to the public policy arena. Okay, so I don't know how to pass the next slide, Sam. Let me see. Oh, let me see.
If you go to the arrows in your computer, you can just press the arrow to the right.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but I don't know what's happening.
Maybe press escape. I think.
Escape, okay.
Yeah. And then you will get out of the presentation.
Let me see. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Okay, let me see if I try this one.
Yeah, and now from current slide, maybe you want to start your presentation up there in the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, the other one, yeah. And then if you go with your arrow.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, okay, now it's working. Thank you. Sorry about that. Again, this is the first time that I'm doing this kind of presentation internationally. So still a lot of things to learn in this new crisis. So a little bit about me. So I was born in Guatemala since 2009. I have the dual citizenship. I've studied in France and the US, and after I graduated from the University of Minnesota with a master's in public affairs, I migrated to the US, and I've been in Minnesota for the last 15 years. And since then, I have had this, I have lived in this intersection of Guatemalan and US politics and policy, given how the US has influenced Guatemala, and how Guatemalans and Latin America also have a huge impact in the US economy, and not only in the US economy, but also culturally, politically, in all sectors that you can imagine. We have had an impact, and particularly for Guatemalan immigrants to the US, the level of remittances or the level of money that is sent by Guatemalans, by workers in many industries, particularly agriculture, particularly in agriculture, that are sent to Guatemala is enormous. I think that is maybe 10% of the GDP of Guatemala, Samuel?
Now it's 12% of the GDP.
12%, yeah, so it's huge. So you can imagine how this is going to affect the Guatemalan economy, since 12% of the GDP is, comes from remittances, money that is sent by Guatemalan immigrants, Guatemala workers in the US to Guatemala. And at the same time, right now, those are sectors, essential sectors or critical sectors that are filled by Latina workers in the States, including Guatemala. And so that connection between the US and Guatemala is, in my lens, is the way that I see the world in many of the issues that I see. And I also publish some columns regarding these topics on 2 online magazines, Plaza Pública and Gazeta. Those are 2 publications that are online, and I believe that Samuel also continues to write sometimes for Plaza Pública as well. So we try to give our perspectives to Guatemala from the perspectives that we have as immigrants or workers in other countries as well. And I'm showing you this picture in particular because, as you can see the date, on March 9th, we had a big rally. That was my last community event. It looks like it was like 1 year ago, but it was only like 1 month ago, where we had this great gathering with with members of the Latino community at the state capitol to rally about issues that impact us. And we had invited our governor, the governor of the state of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and the lieutenant governor, Peggy Flanagan, and they had an address, the public that day, that audience, and that was still when we could still touch each other or hug each other, shake hands, and have huge congregations of people. That was the last, I think that one of the last public events that the governor of Minnesota and the lieutenant governor of Minnesota had on March 9th of 2020. And that was, as I said, almost 1 month ago. And so my agency interacts very frequently, or used to interact more in person with state government, the office of the governor and lieutenant governor, and legislators, of course, and other members of state agencies. And I just want to point out that the lieutenant governor is is Native American. She's part of one of the tribes in Minnesota, and she's right now in the US the highest official who is Native American in the United States. So it was a very important occasion for us 1 month ago. Which brings me to my presentation today, which is to show you a little bit about a local experience from Minnesota during this pandemic. As you know, or may know, we in the United States, we have a federal government, so and it's pretty much decentralized, and each one of our states runs its businesses, runs its governance, pretty much like if they were independent countries. It's like we had different countries in this huge nation. This is how the political system is in the US. And during this pandemic, each state has been trying to cope with this situation with their own means, with their own protocols, with their own guidances, with their own data, with their own resources, since the current administration hasn't given enough either information, guidance, or direction and support to the rest of states. You can see the contrast here in my slides. So I was telling you that on March 9th, March 10th, I think that those were the last days when government or the governor had his last interactions with the public. And on March 13th, he was already declaring a peacetime emergency and coordinating strategy for the state of Minnesota. The president didn't get his until March 25th. So almost 1 week of difference. And of course, other states had already started their plans even before us, because of course they had been touched by this pandemic or this situation before us. By March 16th in Minnesota, the governor had declared the closures of bars, restaurants, and other places of public accommodations. And by March 25th, we were directed to stay at home, to shelter in home. And this stay at home executive order has been extended until May 4th, and the peacetime emergency until May 13th. On March 26th, many of us in our house and our households started to receive from the president his coronavirus guidelines for America. And so there was already this difference in terms of how fast or how slow states have reacted to this situation, to this disaster. But it's clear, and it's clear for many among the population, and it's clear particularly among the governors, that the federal government, this administration, has not reacted timely. And so because of that, the responses of each state have been very, very different. For instance, in our neighbor state of South Dakota, the governor there hasn't declared any kind of emergency strategy or any stay-at-home guidelines. So people are pretty much continue doing their things as usual, and there's been already a company meat plant that has been closed because half of their employees have already been contaminated, have already been infected with the virus. And then there are other states who have taken some precautions earlier, like the state of Washington or California, that are starting to thinking about easing the lockdowns and starting to slowly open the economy. In the case of Minnesota, the governor is still contemplating, is starting to contemplate maybe a gradual opening of the economy, but like in other states, first we need to make sure that there's enough testings and enough focused strategies to contain those who might test positive with coronavirus, and from there then maybe start opening the economy again. So what I'm saying is that each state will have to deal in very different ways with this dilemma around whether you save lives and protect lives, or you open with the effects in the economy, which as you may know right now are devastating, versus opening the economy to get consumers again buying, purchasing, and at the same time getting the states getting the revenues to cope with this economic crisis. So again,
I have a question, Rosa, if you allow me.
Yes.
Just about what you just said, I know there's, maybe you will talk about that later, but I was wondering now the debate about is the power of the president by saying I have the absolute power or not. That debate is now happening in the media. But I was wondering with these guidelines that you just mentioned that was sent from the president versus the local guidelines, is there any power that the local governor has for businesses who open, let's say, is the local government able to put a fine or a sanction, or is the federal government the one that has more power, or is just let people free to decide if they want to open their businesses or not? How does that work in local and absolute power?
No, each government, I mean, each state has local power, since each governor has had the chance to issue an emergency executive order. So they are pretty much, they can pretty much not only set those guidelines, but also enforce whatever fines they can in businesses or with residents as well. So if you are caught in a public gathering of more than 5 or 10 people, if you are in a party, if you are in a park, or if you are in a church or community faith, in big gatherings, you will be fined and maybe be sent to jail. So the local governments have a lot of control and local power in this situation, even though the response from some governors so far to the presidents have been, we are not going to politicize this situation. We are not going to put at risk the lives of people just to open the economy. We need to have our strategies to deal with this situation, because, and so I think that what I've understood from many governors is that they are not going to politicize the situation, and they're going to continue with their strategies, because, as you know, there are many models. There are many models that are showing the spread or the contention or the suppression of the virus. And so based on their local intelligence of their experts, they decide the next steps. And that's something that at this moment, the federal government, I mean, the administration doesn't have any knowledge or control.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so in this slide, you see why there's been a difference in the outcomes of the strategies or this epidemic, this pandemic, and this has to do with the lack of a coordinated action from the government. And then that's how you see these big regional disparities. So you see in the case of Minnesota, we've been pretty lucky so far, not that many deaths compared to, for instance, New York. But at the same time, there's not the capacity, neither the equipment, neither the resources to do the tests, to do the testing. So those are the confirmed cases that you see in front of you, but there might be more. But since we cannot test anybody, I mean, everybody, it's very difficult to tell the real scope of the pandemic in a state like Minnesota that has dealt with it, I would say, pretty well. The other advantage that we have as a state is that we are literally in the middle of the country, very far away from both coasts. So there's not that much, I mean, the twin cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, St. Paul is the city where I live in. They are a metropolitan, very important metropolitan area, pretty cosmopolitan, I would say, but we're not Chicago, a couple of hours from us. Of course, we're not New York, Los Angeles, or Seattle, or so there's not too much traveling if you want, even though, and we're not a very dense city neither, and the state is not very much populated. We are a state of 5.2 million in the state, so I think that also contributes a little bit, but I think that what has contributed the most is the guidance that the governor has had in this situation. So, from my perspective, what has worked and what has not worked when we compare the response of state government versus the response of the federal government and specifically this administration. I think that you can read some of the areas or decisions that have been, or some of the factors that have contributed, at least in Minnesota so far, versus the federal government. And again, each state will have its own story to tell after this. I believe that we have a strong government, and that means that very rapidly, very quickly, the governor has had a very clear direction, very clear communications, and very clear centralization of the information. He's the main spokesperson here, and he's always surrounded by his main experts, including the commissioner of the Department of Health. We have had a very healthy budget and reserves. And overall, because we are one state that taxes very high compared to other states in the country, this state has been able to sustain a pretty healthy safety network. The state of Minnesota, I think, that has a pretty well financed welfare state. And so this has helped a lot in this situation. And again, the fact that this is a government that really believes that it's there to serve its citizens and that really cares to serve its citizens and residents. However, as you might have read, or as you may know, even though each state is going to receive an emergency, which is a $2 trillion package, there are still inequities because there are many people who will not be able to receive financial aid, particularly those in low income brackets and those who work here in the United States but don't have documents. So undocumented immigrants, because they don't have a social security number, they cannot access these kinds of aids. And so that will create also a difference in the outcomes and differences in the treatment, prevention of this virus. I think that there is overall consensus in the US among resident citizens and other sectors that the US government didn't respond quickly, and that this particular administration has been very intentional in undermining science, evidence, facts, and the role of government. We have a leader who is narcissistic in the sense that we don't need that kind of leadership in times of these kinds of crises. I think that his ego, compared to the kind of leadership that we've seen in other countries and in other leaders, is not there to solve this situation. He tends to lie or just tell us very confusing information about what's going on, so that confuses the people. There's been inconsistent messages, and so this will have very clear repercussions, not only in the overall health of the American public, definitely, but also in the economy, and maybe in the next round of elections. So I think that once this is over, if it's over, I think that there would be a lot of thinking and introspection about what kind of leadership, what kind of governance, what kind of public policy, what's the role of government to respond to a crisis of this magnitude, that it is not only local, but it's also international. And so, so far, I would say that the US doesn't pass the test. And for the richest country in the world, not to have enough beds or not enough CUIs or not enough equipment, ventilators, testing, it's really, I think it's really questioning the system in itself, but it's also questioning the kind of leadership that we have right now. That's my personal opinion, by the way. That's not the opinion of the agency I work for, but as a resident and a citizen of this country, it's really worrisome. Okay, so
Rosa,
Samuel,
sorry.
how much time do I have?
You have time, because we have actually the 2 hours slot, but we want to use maybe 1 hour for your presentation. I'm just wondering, there's a question from William about the popularity rate of rating of Donald Trump. I actually shared the one that was sent, but what do you think about that in terms of what you have just said?
I haven't, I don't have the latest polls, but my sense is that it's been fluctuating. So at the beginning of this crisis, his popularity was still pretty strong. Then it went down a little bit. I think that it was at 48, now it's at 42. I don't know where it is right now, but it's been fluctuating so far.
Okay, and we can discuss that later at the end.
Okay. A couple of weeks ago, I was tweeting if this is gonna be Trump's Chernobyl. I suppose that during that disaster, many of you were not born yet. That was in 1986 in one of the former Soviet states in Ukraine, and this was a disaster that occurred in a nuclear plant that was producing energy, and it had consequences in the sense that, not only consequences, but it really revealed that the former Soviet Union, for as much as they were the other power competing with the US at that time for a model that was supposed to be a model that would counter capitalism, etc. That strong centralization of the state was put in question because of the negligence, because of the failure, and because of really hearing the experts so that they could have prevented this kind of disaster to happen. So that overall presence and authoritarian nature or totalitarian nature of that regime might have caused the fall of the former Soviet Union back 30 years ago, 30 something years ago. So is this Trump's Chernobyl? I'm not saying in terms of the magnitude of death, because I think that for this disaster of Chernobyl, there were maybe 5,000, between 5,000 and 10,000 people who died out of this disaster that could have been prevented. But because of its global implications, particularly in Europe, since out of this radiation, the radiation and the consequences of the explosion of this plant, it had also implications in neighboring countries, and obviously repercussions in the environment. But I'm just talking more about the sense of how important it is for governance and for the leadership, again, in terms of the measures that you take as a state, that they have to be really based on what your experts are telling you, on clear guidance, on clear direction, and don't assume that exceptionalism. And that's the thing that sometimes happens with the US. The US sees itself as an exceptional country, and sometimes you have to be a little bit more humble and surrender to the evidence and to the facts and to science. So is this going to have then an implication to Trump's re-election? That's what everybody's asking, is what is going to happen during the elections this year? And we know that you might have heard, you might have read, of course, you are very well informed people, that Sanders quit this his candidacy, and our presumptive nominee is now Joe Biden. You know that there is a contrast in the agendas, and there is a contrast in the philosophies. There is a contrast in the kinds of policies that both Sanders and Biden were campaigning about in the first 8 months of this campaign. And Biden is more of a centrist in the party, in the Democratic Party, whereas Sanders, who, by the way, is not a member of the Democratic Party, but has always voted with the Democratic Party in the Senate, was proposing a social democrat agenda compared to Joe Biden, who is more of a center-right candidate in the Democratic Party. So many people are afraid that this can be a repeat of the 2016 elections, meaning that, remember, 4 years ago, the candidates were Hillary Clinton and Mr. Trump, and everybody would have thought that Hillary Clinton, who is a technocrat, who is a brilliant woman, who is a very well-known person, who was a very well-known candidate, she would win that election. Here we have a Joe Biden also, who is a technocrat, who is very well prepared. I mean, he's been in public service for, I don't know, he's almost 80 years old. He must have been in public service for maybe 50 plus years. So you can say with all certitude that he would be a great president based on his characteristics and his experience and his background. You would assume that, based on the fact that we have a failed administration in this pandemic, and we have a Joe Biden who has also the vice president of Mr. Obama, that the road is paved for the Democratic Party to win in November of 2020. That's for a voter that is a rational thinking. We don't know. We don't know. I wouldn't assume that at this point. Like everybody else right now, we don't know. But we know, however, that there might be some of the implications of this pandemic is that many people might be afraid to go to the polls if they don't have masks, or if they are not reassured that the pandemic, the curve has been flattened, if they are not reassured by the actions of the administration regarding containing this pandemic, many people might be afraid to go to the polls. And what has been one factor that has helped the Democratic Party to win elections, particularly during the Obama campaign, was the turnout of voters. Something that Sanders was also expecting. If you recall, during his campaign, he was really hoping that the youth, particularly youth of color, of minority communities, would go out and support him during the primaries. But many people stay home. And this is why that was one of the factors why Sanders didn't win the primaries as he was expecting. So the Democratic Party is pretty much relying on a huge turnout to win the next elections. But if Joe Biden is not able to capture the attention and to really motivate and inspire the youth and the people like Obama did, or like Sanders was doing, if people are afraid to go to the polls because they don't want to get sick, and if from now to the elections there's no changes in some of the ways to make access to the polls easier, for instance, voting by mail, so maybe the turnout is going to be low, and that might impact the Democratic Party. And that's something that we saw, for instance, in Wisconsin, and this is why I posted this picture here, because in Wisconsin, in our neighbor state, last week, there were primary elections, but they tried to have vote by mail before I think that they tried to, sorry, not vote by mail, they tried to postpone the elections, and there was a decision at the end that didn't allow for the elections to be postponed, so people had to go to the polls. And there were plenty of pictures showing people having this social or physical distance of 6 feet or more, wearing masks, and the pictures show a pretty, I wouldn't say chaotic situation, but almost chaotic situation, and but mostly an apocalyptic kind of situation where people cannot exercise the right to vote in safe conditions. So that might also have some implications. So right now, in many states, there are bills and there are projects to make the vote by mail easier so that people feel confident that without putting their health at risk, they can still exercise the right to vote. And the other thing is that it will also depend on how the economic overlook it's going to be like by end of summer or beginning of the fall. So we have to see how the unemployment rate is. At this moment, I think that we have approximately 16 or between 16 and 20 million US people who are unemployed. So from an unemployment of approximately 3%, I think it was before this crisis, to maybe 15 or maybe 20 by the end of the summer, that might impact the ratings of the president. And the economic tsunami that we can also foresee might have also implications in terms of what the voters are going to think coming November. And finally, we will have to see how the vote of the ethnic and racial minorities will look like. The Latino vote, for instance, we are the second largest voting bloc in the United States after the white population, after the white vote. So it's an important vote, but we will have to see whether or not people are in any conditions to support any of these candidates. Because I think that the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic in the economy are going to affect many people in our communities of color and Native American disparately compared to the white population. So it's a question mark as well. And to make this a perfect storm in the US, we are in the middle of a US census. So as you know, every 10 years, the US conducts a census of the population to count everybody and see, to count everybody. It has huge importance in each state and in each community, because based on the total count of residents in the United States, regardless of immigration status, regardless if you are a citizen or not, everybody that lives in the United States as August of 2020 counts. So, but based on that count, that's how each state, each locality gets federal funds for all the programs, many social programs, health, education, opening of new businesses, or any other kind of aid. And the political, the political redesign, if you want, of the electoral districts. So it's both political representation. So based on the number of people they count, some of these districts are rearranged or redesigned or redrawn. And based on that, also, you will have those shifts in the elections and in the changes of local elections in state legislatures. So all of these will have a lot of implications, because right now also people are a little bit afraid. I mean, their mind is not in starting to fill out or complete a census when they have to maybe take care of other immediate needs. So this is pretty much the outlook of what's going on in the US right now as it pertains to, when it comes to this pandemic, the implications on the election, the implications of the national count of residents in the US, and how the political forces are going to be playing in the next months. So, based on my little explanation of things in this very short time, I just wanted to leave some questions for you. You know, what's next? How you guys think that the world would look like after this pandemic? How would you like the world to look like? And as we know, with these viruses like this COVID-19, which is a novel virus, coronaviruses are here to stay. How you are going to use your skills, everything that you've been learning, to the service of the common good. And I will leave it there. Samuel.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I appreciate a lot of your information here. Your insights are actually triggering lots of questions in my head, but I think also the students may have comments or questions about what we just heard. We know this is just one piece of many other things that are happening around the world too. We had last week, Sarah was making a presentation about how the political system works in the USA, about the districts, the electorate system also, which actually gives a little also insights about what you're saying. But I want to open maybe to students if they want to react, if they want to comment, if they want to share any other thing maybe that hasn't been said, but also if it is related with what Rosa was sharing with us. Let's leave some space for questions and discussion. So just jump in, guys, whoever wants to go.
Hello, can I ask a question? Yeah. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I was just wondering, how it would be impact on voters? Like, if we know that most affected by coronavirus are old people, lack of elderly vote, how it's going to change? Like, do you see if there could be any changes, that there would be more younger voters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I think that it will depend on how the voters will get a chance to vote. And by that, I mean that currently there is a way for people living in senior, in senior centers, that you can bring the ballot to those people, to the seniors, to the old people in these congregated locations. So there's already that, I suppose, all over the United States, meaning that you can vote, you have an absentee vote, and you can vote in advance, and you bring the ballot to those places. So again, it will depend on how well protected the healthcare workers and the caregivers are to bring those ballots, and so they can still vote. So that already exists. So and in terms of the youth, I will hope that that again, if by November we are still facing this situation, that you will be able to vote by mail. So less people will have to actually go to the polls.
And I wanted to ask another question about how do you feel there's attitude towards Chinese people? Because as we know, like, for example, now Trump is blaming China in hiding the seriousness of coronavirus. So how do you feel? How is it in Minnesota?
Yeah. We have a pretty large population of Asian Americans. Approximately 5.5% of the population in Minnesota is of Asian descent, Asian Pacific Islander descent. And yes, we've seen cases of people who just look Asian, not necessarily Chinese, who have been the victims of either physical attacks or harassment or discrimination. And and right now there is the government opened a hotline so that people could call and report these kinds of acts. But it's also prominent in Minnesota, even though the population is very small compared to the rest. Yeah, and yeah.
I see Ruhan and then Rupita raising their hands, so in that order.
I'd first like to thank you for your presentation, but I have a question regarding the spread of COVID-19, more so in the developing countries. And you'll find in developing countries, the concept of staying at home and staying in isolation doesn't work, because a large number of the population relies on paycheck to paycheck to survive. And moreover, for example, in Kenya, where I'm from, a large number of the urban population lives in slums, where there can be up to 10 people sleeping in one room at any given moment. So my question for you is, what would be an appropriate measure to curb the spread of the virus in those conditions?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. And I would have to tell you that those situations at that, what you just described, you would be surprised that you would also find in the United States of America. I mean, not in the same proportions maybe, but you would find this confinement and this density of people, particularly low income and poor people, living in similar conditions. You would be very surprised. So I hear you, and I think that you are completely right. You cannot be asking everybody to be staying at home. I think that we are the lucky ones who can do that, but those essential workers, as I was mentioning here in the US, don't have the luxury to stay at home, and particularly those who are in janitorial occupations, farm workers, and people who are, well, the healthcare workers and the first responders, etc. And in our countries, definitely, the situation is much more acute. So one thing that I've heard, but maybe Samuel can also jump and tell us more from what he's been reading about Guatemala, because we have similar situations in Guatemala. I think that really making sure that every single person is tested, right? That we make sure that we know who are the populations that are already infected, that are asymptomatic, and from there make the decisions and take the appropriate measures to distance them. And while the vaccine is, because we don't have a vaccine right now, so that's the other situation. Right now, all we can do is kind of maybe segregate these communities and bring them the aid and the medical aid, supplies or other that they need to contain that situation. But my sense is that at this point, everybody should be tested and everybody should be brought at least masks to prevent the spread of the virus. And for the states and for the governments, start having a good mapping, all these mappings, maps to tell the public health departments and leaders what the measures and the interventions specifically to these communities might be. That's one suggestion. Samuel, I don't know what's happening in Guatemala in that sense.
Thank you, Rosa. And I saw Rupita's hand, but just want to intervene 1 second with what has been just said. And in the meanwhile, if you want to unshare the screen, Rosa, so we can see our faces. Thank you. I was just thinking about how this situation is unveiling and is just showing the big inequalities, not only in the world between rich countries and poor countries, but also inside countries. We see how in Twitter and all these social media, how people are posting photos of I'm in my house, I'm in my home, but I'm eating whatever, salmon and nice food. And some people are actually in their own pools and they have a nice lifestyle by being stranded. And they have the luxury, as Rosa was saying, to just keep themselves without going to work and having even a good life, a luxury life, I would say. Whereas other people, if they don't go today to work, they won't have any payment. And I will add to Ruan's comment about not only the paycheck, but so many people living in the informal economy by just selling, CDs in the streets or pirate CDs or t-shirts in the streets or even tacos in the street, if we put that in context. If they don't sell today a hot dog, they don't eat tomorrow. So that's the problem of what we are seeing right now. That is really a challenge of how to deal with that. Now, my opinion is that because of the inequalities that we are looking at that are very visible in social media, money there is. The thing is that some people have a lot of money and some people have nothing. So this is actually a consequence of an economy that when it's going well, everybody may be, well, having ways of living, even if we have these inequalities. But now when the economy is not doing well, now we're looking at the problem, because so all these links of the economy are just now exploding or collapsing. So that is when we need a strong state to support. But what we are living in the world is the consequences of weak states in general. That's what we call neoliberal policies that have been taking place in the last 30, 40, or 50 years. So I wonder if we could think about a system in which, or a model in which, these inequalities could actually be redistributed by the state. When we talk about this, it gives, you know, the red flags to many people, because many people will say, this sounds like communism, or this sounds like the government taking over our private freedom. That discussion, I think, is happening in many minds of many people right now. And some of you may have said before, say, well, that was our thought even before the coronavirus. But now is when we're looking at it more clear, and many people are realizing how inequalities are actually being shown. So that's what I want just to add here. I just gonna let Rupita intervene, and if there's any other comments related with this topic, we can come back. Rupita.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. Thank you, Rosa. I really enjoyed that presentation. I think it would be more of I'm seeking your comment rather than a sort of answer to the question. So in previous years, we have seen that how Trump has issued Muslim bans and different sort of anti-immigration policies, and that also in a very economically stable status quo. And amidst this pandemic, now that he also sort of cut the funding for WHO over the fact that they did not endorse the travel ban on China previously. So Trump said that they might have conspired or whatever. There were different allegations and comments thrown. So my sort of the situation would be currently, even after or when or if the pandemic's over, for the immigration policy of US, as long as Trump is in power, what does that situation look like? And what does that mean for a lot of international workers, international students, and even businesses?
Great question, great question. I think that it's gonna be a status quo. I don't think that under this administration, and if the president gets reelected, that there's gonna be any changes, even though right now we see how important not only let's say the low-skilled workers are, but especially the high-skilled workers, because many of the high-skilled workers, the doctors, the nurses, the scientists, they come from, they are immigrants, you know, from Asia and from other regions of the world. And the kinds of visas that they have right now, to many of them, don't allow them to practice or to be employed because of the different laws in each state regarding how they can convalidate their training and their certificates with with the US kinds of occupations in the medical sector. So we are seeing that we need both. We need the low-skilled and the high-skilled immigrants. And more than ever, we would have needed a comprehensive immigration reform to absorb in the economy all of the different kinds of immigrants that have helped the economy in the US. So you are right about the importance of immigrants, regardless of any kind of crisis or disaster that we are living. But my sense is that there's going to be very little change in the next years, and I don't think that there's going to be too much of a change if this president gets reelected. Actually, I think that some of the proposals that I've heard, that I've read of, is that they would want, this administration would want to reduce the wages of farm workers who come with a specific visa, work visa. I think it's the one visa, I think, for specific farm workers that come from Mexico to respond to the economic crisis. They want to reduce the wages of these farm workers. So what I'm saying is that we will continue to have this kind of patchwork of measures that are not that are counterproductive to both the economy of this country, but also to the integration of so many immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, which are approximately 10 to 11 million people in the US. So great question.
Thank you.
I'm gonna add a little bit of what Rosita said also something about this title that became very popular, Is the Economy Stupid? Which it was, in other words, saying that any elections are going to be influenced as long as people have, a secure, a safe way to solve their economic individual problem. So if unemployment is low, if GDP is growing, if people are having jobs and people are okay with that, then that's their individual problem is being solved. Any other problems are secondary. Now, what we are gonna see in the next months is that if there's a recession coming, Trump may be, well, it depends on how Donald Trump is gonna be handling the recession. And I remember also when Trump was just elected after Obama's administration, we had a conversation with Rosita and she said, you know what's gonna happen? People are still going to go to work, people are gonna mow their lawn, people are gonna go to Disney World. So people are gonna live their lives as nothing has happened, because what is important for them, again, is their economy. Their economy is, they are okay, if they are working, then who cares about the other things that are actually important to think about? All these comments of building a wall and these other things that were actually raising our worry around the US politics were actually secondary for many citizens in the USA as long as they had a job, particularly after the recession that Obama was actually facing and redressing in his two administrations. So what I see here also happening, maybe based on William's question, is that right now maybe the popularity of the current administration is still high because people are still working and people are okay. They are not really suffering any economic problem. But if this becomes a big issue in the next couple of months, as it seems to be, now unemployment is rising exponentially and many people are now receiving checks. But what will happen if these checks start to diminish, if there's no more money that can be distributed, or if the distribution of government support is not enough or not going to everyone? That may reduce the popularity of Donald Trump. But I don't know if I'm wrong, Rosa.
Oh. I think that's a great analysis. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions? Please jump in, guys. Samira has a comment on the chat. Do you want to voice it, Samira?
Sure. I just read an article a couple hours ago about how Macron asked for a world truce, like with world leaders, over the virus. So like no wars and like more alliances between countries. So do we want to talk about that? Do we think it's possible? Like for countries that weren't allies before to work together and call for a world truce, especially since there are a lot of terrorist organizations who have been they put their activities on hold, like their organizations on hold due to the virus.
Thank you, Samira. And the question is also, is this crisis bigger than the other type of crisis that countries are facing between themselves?
Yeah, like I remember discussing in a class with Shefa, and we were talking about when does this like dictatorship and authoritarian regimes come. And I remember he said something that really stayed on my mind, that is like when people are really fearful, like we are now, they will tend first to blame someone else and and second, they will tend to like to promote an authoritarian regime, or to promote an authoritarian figure, as for example Trump is. Like, yeah, like he even say like strong males will tend to win when we are under circumstances that are really that really make us scary. That has been the trend in the past. So I was just wondering if this crisis is gonna just increase the nationalist trend that has been already happening around the world, and that's something that I'm afraid of, because like what Trump is doing right now is rejecting immigrants out, and every country saying, okay, we just want the resources for ourselves. We are really taking a realistic perspective right now under these circumstances in a lot of places. And I wonder if that's the turn that's going to happen after the coronavirus. Just an increase in populist regimes and authoritarian regimes around the world.
Anybody wants to jump in? What are your thoughts? I think that both questions are good. I mean, they are legitimate. For instance, Samira, here in the US, since March, there hasn't been a single school shooting, whereas in other months of the year, you would be having daily or almost weekly school shootings, mass shootings, and in 1 month, that hasn't happened. So that was something that I thought of. And for Alan, I also thought maybe you are completely right. This might be an opportunity for those kinds of leaderships to arise, particularly because there's more control also over how do you call it, over technologies. And if they're asking people to report about their health through mobiles and cell phones and all of that, what's the kind of control that the state can also get into? So those are good questions, but I would open it for the rest of the class.
I'm going to jump in also about not only the truth, but also on the other hand, what is going on in the media right now about Trump. In a conference, he said that he has the power to make the country go back to work. And that's, I think, what worries a lot the US administration right now, that the economy will suffer and is starting to suffer. So they want to get people back to work, as he's saying, as soon as possible. And I wonder how the states look at that. Do you think that in Minnesota is people are going to be reacting in an opposite way? They'll be waiting more and prioritizing more health over the economy coming back? Or also, is this a challenge towards Trump's legitimacy and authority in a democratic and free country like the USA? How can you put that, not only Rosa, but also thinking about the US students here, Sarah and Miles, what would you say about, what do you think about those comments about the president?
Well, I think that in the end, it will again resort to the mobilizing and organizing of citizens. We haven't seen those social movements since this has, since the pandemic, if you want. You know, we are all kind of retreated as citizens to our houses, kind of reduced to our individual spaces. But I think that in the end, there's going to be at a certain moment ways for citizens to mobilize again and react if this is were to happen. I think so. I've seen it in Minnesota, at least some grassroots organizations and community leaders who have been rallying for different issues. What they do is that they go out in their cars and they protest in front of government agencies, and they keep their social distance by staying in their cars, but they are still mobilizing. So I believe that more than ever, we don't need to surrender to our self-agency, and we don't need to surrender to the fact that we are confined or to these individual spaces, but I believe that there's going to be, again, this kind of counter reactions to those who would want to go through this authoritarian path. In Minnesota, we haven't seen that much of a resistance yet to the governor's emergency executive order. But that truce, talking about truce, that truce that for a little while we had between both parties, the governor is a Democrat and we have a divided legislature. So we have seen some sort of truce between the parties collaborating for aid and guidance in this, but that truth is starting to, as the Speaker of the House put it, that collaboration is on a ventilator right now. So that unity is starting to weigh down. So, but we haven't seen the kind of reaction, for instance, in Michigan. I think that some people were actually, without any social distance, protesting against the governor, against her measures to continue to have the economy locked down. That we haven't seen here yet, but I would hope that that again the expert advice, the models that each state are coming with, they will be able to bring back people to realize that even though we are all having to have these sacrifices, that for now this is what's gonna help lives and save lives. So.
Thank you. I guess Sarah wanted to react, or if not, I see Racim raising his hand. So Sarah?
Racim can go first. I'm still thinking, but thank you.
Thank you. And there's also a question posted by Ha about that idea of Trump threatening to adjourn Congress, and if anyone wants to comment about that too. So Racim.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to answer on this idea of trust, and especially trust led by Macron. Even though a few years ago I used to give a lot of support to Macron's policies, I do not think that right now he is in a position in which he can ask all the different actors in the different wars to stop for a moment the battles. In order to do that, you need to have good relationship with all the actors in a certain way, of course. And right now, he is having some troubles with Donald Trump. We can remember a few weeks or months ago, they had some bad word exchanges, some insult even. And I'm also thinking of his relationship with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, who is also a major actor in war conflicts. And in this case, if there's one leader that could be able to reach a trust goal, it would be Russia's president, Putin. which in this moment has his country to protect, since we know the COVID-19 case in Russia was a bit lately managed. He has enough influence over Trump, since we know their friendly relationship, if it can be called as such. And he has also a lot of influence over Erdogan, who is one of his allies in the Middle East, and is also close to Syria's president and most of the war actors as China or others. And in the same time, I do not think that the interest of collaborating for a pandemic or against a pandemic can be linked to the interest to stop war. If we think a bit about 1929 economical crisis, what stopped that economical crisis was the World War II. So if we expect a recession greater than that one, for most of the countries, such as France, United States, China, Russia, it will be more beneficial to keep on going the fight in order to maintain a strong economy for the country. So that's why I can hardly see how it would be possible.
Thank you, Racim. Interesting, and I agree with a lot of what you were saying about the leadership of Macron now asking for a truce. There are a couple of questions in the and comments in the chat. One is about how different countries are dealing with containing the virus. There's a question from William saying, what do you think about what's happening right now in Sweden, that they are isolating only the elderly people who are the people at risk? Then there are also some responses about that. I remember Ty here at the college saying how if the college is isolated, we may have a very safe place because we're avoiding the virus to enter. So, but on the other hand, he compared the college to a cruise ship. And he said, well, the cruise ship could be very, very safe, but once it enters, it could be the worst place to be at because then it spreads out and we are in an isolated place. So it's a two-side story of isolating just a certain population. To what extent can we make sure that they are not really getting sick? And there's a response from Myril that she's saying that in Stockholm, there's still a lot of people dying because the strategy is not working as well, very well. There's people become immune, or they are saying that because of isolation, people are immune, which is not necessarily the situation. There's also a question from Elena. I saw your question. Do you want to voice it, Elena? Maybe it's interesting, and it's maybe related with the amount of ventilators that the USA has, because we have seen how in the world the situation is becoming another problem.
So I was actually reading this article about what's going on between the US and Cuba. So apparently, Trump administration has denied the Cuba health minister is a visa to get to Washington to attend like an important meeting. And since Cuba is being like really active in international like aid, for example, a lot of Cuban doctors are in Italy right now and have been in Italy during the last weeks to actually help out him, especially in the northern Italy. I was just actually wondering if you, I don't know, can expand more on that, and I don't know, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, we've seen how the Cubans always respond to any kind of health public health crisis, or they have been always in solidarity with many countries during their respective disasters. So it's amazing to see how such as a small country, small island, with the kind of regime that they are actually more prepared than a country like the US, which, as we know, has a kind of worships capitalism as the solution to everything, whereas the island has another kind of state and political and economic regime, and they are able to actually come to support Western democracies and developed countries. Yeah, it's a kind of paradox between the different systems. In the case of the US, yeah, finally the president has enacted the name escapes to me right now, but it's kind of asking big companies, big manufacturing companies, to start producing ventilators and equipment to cope with this crisis. And I think that he's reacting a little bit late, but at this point we still don't know how many ventilators they will be able to produce, and we still don't know again how his administration is going to be supporting each state with the kind of equipment that is needed, which shows again how in the US we don't have a cohesive public health system, and that that the health system, which is mostly private in the US, hasn't been able to respond to the magnitude of this public health crisis. So that shows you a little bit again to contrast the systems in each country and give you a sense of how important public goods are, including having a strong public health system in this situation. So as part of the questions that we need to think for the future is what kind of new system do we want to build? Do we want to continue with this kind of fractured private public health system, health system, or do we want to build one that really takes into consideration the public good, the common good?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm starting to wrap up, and maybe just to see if there's any final thoughts, final questions from anyone here. Oh, Miles, can you please ask the question, please, if you can unmute?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I was curious about is we're looking at U.S. economic response to a lot of COVID, and a lot of that comes down to increasing the amount of unemployment that's being paid out to people, guaranteed stimulus checks to any taxpayers, economic stimulus in the financial sector itself with trillions of dollars of liquidity being injected. I mean, this is kind of a step away from traditional, I guess, more kind of neoliberal U.S. economic policy. And I know we did have a lot of economic intervention after 2008, but I felt like a lot of that permanence kind of faded as we got further and further from the crisis. However, in the sense of COVID, where you see staggering unemployment, do you think there will be a redefining of how we view kind of basic sustenance policies such as UBI or unemployment way after the crisis?
Another great question. I think that the economic stimulus has, it's better than nothing for sure. It's better than nothing, but it has been pretty much catered to also save the big businesses to reactivate the economy, but has left some other social measures or policies behind, particularly sick leave, childcare, maybe eliminating the debt of college students in the US, or also providing for assistance to rent or housing. So I think that this first package has been pretty much limited, and I understand that there is a need also to reactivate the economy and support the businesses, but not only bailing out the companies, but also bailing out families and individuals who will be suffering disproportionately from this crisis. So I believe that there's already talks right now for a second financial aid package, and I would hope that it would also include more provisions beyond the unemployment insurance and others like that, so that people can also reactivate their own family economies and local economies, etc. Because I think that this is even worse than the recession that we saw in 2008. And that's when I would agree with Samuel when he says about the importance of having this strong government, in this case, to not only supplement, but also be the engine for the economic reactivity. And so we can think of measures and public policy measures like after the Great Depression in the United States, where the government started to employ unemployed people in huge projects, like, for instance, building parks and trails in national parks. I mean, there were plenty of people who were unemployed, and the state, the government, actually employed them in these big projects that provided for employment for all these people and helped reactivate the economy. So that's where we need to start conceiving the state also as one that can reactivate the economy, and not only bailing out the corporations or the private companies.
Thank you, Rosa. And I'm going to add a little bit, trying to answer Samira's question as well. The idea of where is the money coming from. So basically, the government has two sources of money. One will be debt. So making loans, not only to private banks, but also to their own bank, which is the Fed, and also to other countries. Like in 2008, actually, Obama made a lot of loans to China. The USA still owes a lot of money, billions of dollars, that they have to pay back to China, because they were the ones who financed the stimulus package that was set in the USA to rescue the big banks and everything that happened in the USA. So now they are still paying the debt, but now there's another recession coming, so they have to get more debt. So that's the big problem that everyone is thinking. How is the world going to be able to pay the debt back if now they haven't been able to pay the debt of the former recession 10 years ago? So that's one of the problems. The second source of income will be just printing money. They say you have the ability to print money, you will print money and just overflow the country with money. Now that is not sustainable, because just printing money doesn't mean that you are producing goods. And of course, money has to be backed up by goods. If you're just printing money, then you're solving poverty, but then you're not solving the real problem. You're just creating inflation, as we call it. So the situation here is now we are in a situation that has never happened before. So it's not the same as in the 20s, but right now the governments have to deal with how to make the economy to recover, but also how to pay back the debt in the future. One thing that Rosita said was the Keynesian policies, or the Roosevelt plan, was to invest in public services. So the roads that happen to be built in the USA that we still have now were built on that time. Even swimming pools and rec centers and stadiums, many things that were public goods, parks, as she was saying, they were built during the Roosevelt era. That was the response to the economic problem. So creating jobs in order to give people money so they can spend back to the economy and then make the economy go back again. Now, two things happen. One is that those structures were helping the economy to become more productive later, because now you have roads, you have schools, etc. And so people were more productive. But the second thing that happened was what Racine was mentioning, which was a war. The war helped the economy actually to invest in weapons and tanks, and paying for all these uniforms that need to be produced for the Second World War. So that being said, the situation now is different. There's an interesting proposal, which is, how about reshaping the economy by investing in green technologies? Let's say, let's invest in solar panels. Let's invest in new ways of producing goods without using petrol and oil. That could be an idea to recover the economy in a different way for the future. Now, nobody's really proposing that seriously. We have that Green New Deal that was kind of the idea of Bernie Sanders, and I think there's also in the Congress, but still nothing is really clear. The last thing that we can think about is where the money is coming from. We can think about redistribution. Very rich people, and then the government will be the one that will be redistributing to the very poor in the economic crisis. Now, ask who wants to do that? So of course the rich people will say, no, this is not the way of doing it in a democratic and a liberal free market economy. So this is the discussion that right now is taking place right now in the world, in the mind of people. Alan just asked, is printing money illegal? Yes, it is, but only if there's an emergency. Most of the states have that last resort of borrowing money from the central bank, which is the one who prints money, to put it very simple. So it's illegal unless there's an emergency. So it still is legal if there's an emergency, and some countries are doing that. Now they have to pay back to the bank later. It's like a loan, but just printing money. We can talk about that later in economics, Alan. So I just want to finish here with these ideas in our heads, because we need to wrap up. I want to thank Rosita for her time. She's a very busy woman, but right now she dedicated 2 hours to us, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you guys for also your presence on time in the class. For next week, we will not have really a homework to work, but I want just you to think about, in 1918, there was this big Spanish flu, as it was called. So what do you think could have been something that these people wrote, if they wrote a letter to you, that you would like to hear from them? Let's say lessons learned that you would love to have learned now that we are facing this new pandemic. The question is there anything that we would love to know before this happened? And if you can just take 1 minute of your time during the weekend to write a little letter to your, let's say, your grandchildren, even if you won't have. Let's think about grandchildren in the next 2 generations. What would you tell them as now that we're living this, as an advice to prevent what is happening right now? Let's write a letter to the grandchildren of the world in the future, telling them what we are facing right now could be prevented or could be dealt in a different way that is being dealt so far, maybe, or maybe not. So if we can just write those letters, and we're gonna have the next session to share a little bit our thoughts, if that makes sense. Let's work on that. I will summarize that in an email, so you will have that in written. And I just want to thank again, Rosita, if you want to give some words to just wrap up, and then we will be done.
Well, thank you so much. With all your questions and also your attendance, I think, Samuel, that we are in good hands. I think that this youth is gonna help us, is very well equipped, and with professors like you, with guidance like you, Samuel, and also the interest that everybody's bringing to this issue, I think that we need to be better because of the youth and this citizen, kind of global citizen philosophy that we are building together. So I'm very glad and I'm very fortunate to have had this discussion with you. And thank you again, Sam, for inviting me. Adios. Hasta pronto.
Thank you very much. Hasta pronto. So I will send an email to just wrap up and confirm what is the assignment for next week. And thank you very much, guys. Keep being safe, and we'll see economic students later today. Bye.
Gracias a ti, Rosa. Hasta luego.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Thanks,
Merci.
Samuel. Bye.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Rosa. Gracias, Samuel.
Nada. Gracias a ustedes. Bye.
Tengan buen día.
Igual.
Ok, gracias, Rosita. Ya no te
Me
quito
voy.
tiempo.
Hasta la próxima.
Nos hablamos luego.
Ok,
Bye.
chao.